the world of politics.
It was highly produced, people reading teleprompters and really kind of giving you a book report of what they've heard over the last few months.
To the world of business.
I am optimistic that we will see some cooling of inflation, consumption patterns renormalizing, which will put some pressure on services, but nonetheless, we see a rebalancing, which I think will be healthy for price stability as well.
This is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. The markets continue to react to those hot inflation numbers from Friday, and Abigail Doolittle is here to take us through them. So, Abigail, I'm not going to hold you accountable for this. I was going to say, what did you do to us? But boy, it is something out there.
It really is. It's a brutal sell-off that we're looking at. The S&P 500 right now down about 3%. Now, that is off the lows, but nonetheless down 3%, down for 4 days in a row, 10% over those last 4 days, the worst 4 days going back to March of 2020. So that's the kind of selling pressure we're looking at. It's even worse for big tech because, of course, it has to do with inflation, as you were talking about, yields going higher, making everything more expensive. Now, yields going higher, that is driving the dollar up more than 2% over the last 4 days. The S&P 500 down 4%. It's relentless.
Well, and normally one would say, well, it's a rush to safe haven for the dollar, right? Partly anticipation of Fed rate hikes. But look at the yen.
Well, it's very interesting. So this is not 2008, because in the dark days of 2008, you had both the dollar soaring and you had the yen soaring. So that's not happening here, at least yet. So that is some sort of relief, I guess, to investors. But nonetheless, when you look at the fundamentals, last week we had the lowest UMISH confidence number on record. There's really signs here that a recession could be coming. The 2-10 yield curve right now, very close to an inversion again. The last time I looked at about 8 basis points. That seems likely since it inverted also in early April.
And is it stretching it too far to say that's what we're also seeing with oil? Because oil is actually off today.
Yeah.
Which might be in anticipation of at least a slowdown, if not a recession.
Well, it's so interesting that you're bringing up that point, because I believe we saw that on Thursday or Friday where you had stocks off hard. I think it was on Friday, and oil down too. And absolutely, because oil at the end of the day is a risk asset. Commodities are a risk asset. It's a tell on the economy. Copper, a tell on the economy. So when you have oil down in this inflationary situation, I mean, listen, I was just away for the weekend. I paid $85 on the way back, which I know is not even a lot relative to some other people. But for me, it was eye-opening. I was thinking to myself, I myself am getting to the point where this might do something. But oil is down, and that has everything also to do with that rising dollar. Very rough environment. Yeah,
and you and 330 million other Americans, which is part of President Biden's problem. Thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. And now we want to understand what lies behind this. And for that, you turn to an economist, and we turn to Douglas Holtz-Eakin. He's president of the American Action Forum and former director of the Congressional Budget Office. So, Douglas, thank you so much for being with us. Sure. Is it all about inflation? And I guess my question is, how can we have inflation like this and be so concerned about recession at the same time?
I think there are really two things going on here, David. One is we came into this year with a lot of excessive stimulus on both the fiscal and monetary fronts. Second half of 2021, the inflation was already picking up, and really nothing was done to reverse course. And so I think there was a fair amount of froth in a lot of these asset markets and pricing above fundamentals, and that's been corrected. Now we're looking at the fundamentals, and I think people are learning really two very important things. Number one, the scale of the problem that the Fed faces in trying to control inflation, the gap between real interest rates, the instrument they can actually use to control inflation, and the inflation rate is as large as it has been since the early 1970s. And that was a nearly decade-long struggle to get inflation under control. I'm not saying it'll be a decade long, but it's a big problem. The scale of the problem means a lot of financial tightening, shrinking portfolios, raising rates, and I think people are just coming to terms with that for the first time. And you see a lot of, I think, quite shocked investors out there realizing what's gone on. The second is that past the sort of near-term issues with the Fed tightening and controlling inflation, there doesn't appear to be any strategy for long-term growth that the administration can sell to people. They're looking out there and seeing, okay, we're going to slow down the economy. Best news is we avoid a recession, but we're not going to grow. And where's the growth, I think, is the second big issue that's plaguing the market. They need to see a strategy to really get some genuine growth when they're worried about the inflation and the potential for a recession down the line.
Doug, in your estimation, do you think the Fed can get inflation under control without triggering a recession? And by the way, do we have to have increased unemployment, substantially increased unemployment, to have that happen?
Well, the Fed is going to raise rates, shrink the portfolio, and that is going to be, other things being the same, bad news for the monthly data that we get, from Bloomberg. We're going to see monthly employment reports that show higher unemployment rates, slower job growth. We're going to see retail sales that are slower than they've been this past spring. We're going to see a housing market that has to cool down. That's a big transmission mechanism for a Fed tightening. And all of that means that we're going to get a slowing economy. The real question is, will it just slow or will it actually dip into negative territory? You can't rule out the Fed pulling off a soft landing, but you can look at the track record and recognize that in these circumstances, inflation above 4, unemployment below 5, the Fed's never historically pulled it off. So we're asking them to do something that is at odds with their historical record.
Doug, you talk about the economy slowing. How quickly will it slow? Because we see a lot of reports that particularly consumers' household balance sheets still have a lot of cash. And the consumer could keep spending for a good long time to come. Could he not?
Yeah, I think one of the real puzzles this spring has been the gloomy consumer sentiment numbers, which we see every month and are now at lows rivaled only by the 1980s, and the personal income and outlay numbers where, personal outlays household outlays have been very strong. There's cash on the balance sheets. There's enough income growth. It's not great to support that. And so this economy is not going to slow overnight. And I'm not really genuinely concerned about elevated inflation or elevated recession risks in 2022. I think the elevated recession risks are in the second half of 2023. The near term is the Fed leaning hard against an economy that is actually running quite hot.
Douglas, I think that one of the challenges we have is it's been a while since we've had a big downturn, and there are a lot of people, money managers and others, investors, who haven't really had to deal with it before. One of the things I wonder if is different this time in this downturn, which seems to be what we're heading for, is we have so much of the market in passive investing. What could that mean for handling the downturn?
I think one of the most important things the stock market does, from an economist's point of view, is price discovery. How do you identify promising new uses for assets when you're coming out of a downturn? How do you repurpose capital in the economy? The stock market sends those signals. The only way that happens is if someone's taking a risk, saying, hey, I think this is more valuable than everyone else. I'm going to buy it. And that's going to lean against what all the passive investors are doing. If no one's out there doing price discovery, no one's out there doing the risk taking that leads to reallocating capital, the stock market is a less efficient entity. And so all of that passive investing, I think, runs that risk.
Douglas, as I say, we always ask economists why. Let me ask you another why. You said earlier that the markets are just figuring out the problem with inflation. Why were people surprised on Friday? Were you surprised?
I was not surprised. I don't know why people were surprised. If you look at the producer price index, we'll get another edition of that tomorrow. That's been running in double digits for months. And so there's a lot of pressure on prices that comes from the pipeline. There was no reason to expect the CPI to simply drop off. And anyone who either believed that spin coming out of policymakers or somehow thought that was what was in the data, I think really was misreading the situation.
Okay, we can't let you go without asking about the Federal Reserve, which is meeting later this week. We're going to have a decision on Wednesday. Where are you on what the Fed should do, not just for this meeting, but for the one in July and in September?
I think they should stick to their plan. I mean, they've been talking an aggressive game, 50 basis points, 50 basis points, 50 basis points. Absolutely, they should do that. And they could continue to shrink the portfolio. We do not yet know how much financial conditions tighten as they do that. That's a wild card. And so do that and then take a look and if necessary, continue at 50 basis points. Do what you need to show a discernible decline in measured inflation.
We talked about likelihood, possibility of recession. What about stagflation? And how important are consumer and the market's expectations? And I guess what I'm really asking is, what happens if we lose faith in the Fed?
That is everything at the moment. That is why the Fed, I think, has talked a big game to try to convince consumers, investors that they can control this inflation and will. That is why they need to stick to their game plan and not appear to, again, make a mistake by misreading the situation as they did last year. And if you can control inflation expectations, you take that propagation mechanism that was such a problem in the 70s and early 80s and take it off the table. If people aren't expecting 5-6% inflation, they aren't asking for 5-6% raises, and you don't have the cost pressures in the economy that you otherwise would. That's a crucial part of Fed success, convincing people and following through to make them take those expectations back down to where they were, 3% or so at the beginning of the year.
Doug, thanks so much for being with us today. That's Douglas Holtz-Eakin of the American Action Forum. Coming up here, Congress holds its second hearing on the events of January 6th and moves toward enacting new gun legislation. We talk with House Democratic Whip James Clyburn of South Carolina. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. The House Select Committee investigating the events of January 6th is continuing its second public hearing right now. It's in recess at the moment. And to tell us what we have learned so far today, we turn to our Washington correspondent Anne-Marie Hordern on Capitol Hill. So Anne-Marie, what have we learned?
Well, David, it's a lot of what we saw in the first hearing, and this is the second one of 7. That one was prime time. This one is in the morning, so potentially it remains to be seen whether or not they're going to get the viewership. But the tone is a little bit similar, but they're digging into the details of what President Trump knew and when. And really, one of the key witnesses they have and the testimony they are sharing is that of his former Attorney General, William Barr. He's talking about the fact that this was bogus. He told the president so. He said even before the election results were in, the president was making these false claims and declaring victory without having the evidence. So they are trying to paint a picture that these individuals, whether it's a political team, whether it's the former president's legal team, telling the president that these are false claims. And instead, the president rejected those claims. And you heard from Representative Liz Cheney saying he went with what apparently was a, quote, inebriated Rudy Giuliani to then say these are not official claims and I'm going to go after and say that this election was false. And also, David, campaign on that in terms of raising money and funds.
Okay, thank you so much for that update. That's Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern reporting from Capitol Hill. And now we go to a veteran of Capitol Hill. He's Representative Jim Clyburn of South Carolina, who serves as the House Majority Whip. That is the third most senior Democratic position in the House of Representatives. So, Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. Let me ask you the ultimate question. You are a veteran of Capitol Hill. What's the most effective thing that could come out of these hearings, in your opinion?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I think that they're making a case today for what I think is going to be the most effective, and that is to debunk the claims that have been made by former President Trump over and over and over again. And I think that Bennet Thompson and the committee have done great work in having the counter to Trump's claims to come from his own inner circle. All Republicans, lawyers, campaign manager, people who worked for him, people who wanted to win the election, people whose futures depended in large measure upon the outcome of the election, and they're telling him that he lost, and he should accept that. So to the extent to which the public, looking in on these hearings, can come to the conclusion that Trump actually lost this election fair and square, and it's time for the country to move beyond the 2020 election and think about what kind of a future we are making for our children and our grandchildren, and stop reliving this lie.
Congressman, beyond the House Select Committee meetings on January 6th, there are other historic events going on right now on Capitol Hill, and one of those has to do with potential gun legislation. It appears there is a bipartisan agreement. It appears it's likely to go through the Senate. Could you give us a sense of how important this is? I know you've had your own experience in South Carolina with some tragic incidents.
Absolutely. I'm watching this very closely, and quite frankly, I am a bit reticent to respond to a framework because I have not seen legislative language, and I'm particularly interested in what we're doing with background checks. We can talk all we want to about mental health and all of that, but I think of the Emanuel 9 daily on the 17th, next Friday, we're going to be commemorating the anniversary of that horrible incident. I will be in Charleston. I will be there gathered with survivors and their families. And we are going to talk about this legislation and what it does or does not do. So if you are refusing to raise the level for purchases of assault weapons up to 21, when all the experts, all of the science say the brain of a 21-year-old is not yet fully developed, usually around 25. You got to be 25 years old to do certain things, to rent an automobile. But at 18, you can buy an assault weapon. That, to me, is crazy.
Congressman, I understand that at least the descriptions we've seen in the framework may well fall short of what you would prefer. But I guess the obvious question is half a loaf better than none? Or would you rather actually not take the half a loaf in hopes that you can get the full loaf at some point down the road?
Oh, well, I think you know me better than that. I'm a half loaf sort of guy. I'm a Lyndon Johnson Democrat. A half loaf is better than no loaf at all. I want the whole loaf. I will settle for the half loaf, and hopefully we'll come back later and get the rest of it. But that doesn't mean I'm going to be satisfied and rest on that. I'm going to still be working to try to do the whole thing.
Congressman, I know that you are a close friend of President Biden, and we've talked about this before. A lot of people think that you're the reason he's in the White House at this point. President Biden has said that he is going to run again in 2024. Now there are reports, you saw the New York Times over the weekend, that said maybe some Democrats think he shouldn't. Apart from whether he will or won't, as his friend, would you advise him, given everything that's happened, for him to run again in 2024 if he turned to you and said, what should I do?
Well, if he would ask me that question today, I'll tell him, yes. Keep looking to the future. We have no idea of what it's going to be like in 2024. None of us know. And so what I would say to the president, keep doing your job. 2022 is upon us. 2024 is before us. Let's just take care of business today, and we'll let the future take care of itself. So this whole notion of he should or should not do is something 3 years from now. I'm not too sure that that's worth our time.
But 2022 is here, as you said, and
yes.
I see you're pretty active right now. Now, outside of South Carolina, you've been campaigning a fair amount around the country. Give us your sense of the state of the Democratic Party going into these midterm elections.
Well, I think that we're making a mistake when we keep talking about the Democrats' lack of message. We got a great message. That's not the problem. Our problem is to put in place the kind of messengers that can go out to the public and help translate for the American people exactly what the Democrats are all about. And that's why I have been involved in some of these primaries, because I know after talking to people, not just in South Carolina, I've been in Connecticut, I've been down in Florida, I've been in Georgia, I've been in New Jersey, Michigan, all of this within the last 30 days. And I can tell you, they are looking to us to fulfill this agenda that's been laid out by President Biden. They like it. They want to see us implement it. And a lot of them are focused on the fact that we have not done everything that we said we're going to do. And I have to keep telling them, and our messages got to tell them, we are a year and a half into a 4-year term. Don't expect for us to do the whole 4 years in the first 1.5 years. If we talk about the glass being half full, rather than focusing on the fact that it's half empty, we will do better.
So this is Bloomberg, as you know. We focus on the economy, but voters tend to focus on pocketbook issues as well. Are the Democrats winning or losing in the midterm election right now on the message of really delivering on the economy? A lot of polling suggests they're not too happy with the White House.
Well, people are not happy. They're not happy with their circumstances. Nobody's happy with paying $5 for a gallon of gas. I can remember when $1 I could fill up my tank and drive all day. That's not the case. And the $5 per gallon of gas, that's a problem. Seeing all of the inflated prices, that is a problem for us. And so I would hope that this administration and the Fed will get together and do the things that are necessary to bring this inflationary spiral under control. Now, anytime you start pumping money into the economy, which is what we did with the Rescue Act, what we did with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and the ominous appropriations bill. All of these things were saying to people with nothing to inflate, you need to be able to make a living by purchasing. And all of a sudden, when this money gets out there, people start running up the prices. So we've got to find a way to check all of this. Nobody in the investor class is losing money. Show me one person in the investor class that's losing money. The banks are making money. Corporations are making money. Big CEOs making more money. It is the people, the hard-working, day-to-day people that we are trying to take care of with these three big bills the Biden administration has passed. They are the ones that are suffering because the big decision makers keep running up the prices so they can make more in their dividends.
A fair point, Congressman. A lot of people have made a lot of money over the last few years. I must say today, there are a lot of investors who are losing money given what the markets are doing. It's always such a treat to have you with us. That's Congressman Jim Clyburn of South Carolina. Still to come, we talk with Dan Yergin of S&P Global about how energy markets are responding to falling markets overall. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. It's a markets kind of day, not necessarily in a good way, and Kriti Gupta is here for a report. Kriti?
Well, the selling continues, David, and you're looking at an S&P 500 that was down as much as, I want to say, 3.5% at one point. It has pared back some of those losses, but still we're looking at losses of 2.9% on the day. So this isn't by any measure a cheery day if you are a bull in this market. The NASDAQ taking it even worse, down 3.6%. And of course, the Russell 2000 down almost 4%. This is huge when it comes to the volatility picture. You're looking at a 32 handle on the VIX. Remember, over 30 has become kind of the post-war norm after the war in Ukraine. But it's really that volatility that's also feeding into the bond market and the dollar. Arguably, you could say that the yield story, the higher yields, the inflation report from Friday is feeding into the stock story. And of course, bringing in the dollar. I mean, David, we're looking at 331 on the 10-year. These are some pretty wild numbers.
Yeah, no kidding. And the rate of change has really been striking, particularly on the 10-year, the yield. I mean, it's like 20 basis points or something today, right?
Yeah, this snowballing, I think, to your point, is crucial, and especially when it comes to the dollar. That dollar strength story continues to get higher and higher, especially when you look at what it's doing to some of these other currencies. The dollar-yen story, once again, has become front of mind. 135 on that exchange.
Okay, so I'm going to put you on the spot. I have no idea what the answer to the question is. Any indication of capitulation?
There isn't an indication of capitulation yet, and that's what a lot of people have concerns about. That is the bear market over, which, by the way, we are in bear market territory again. Is the bear market over once everyone just kind of throws up their hands in the air and says, well, we've capitulated? The other side of the equation is, well, sure, financial conditions are tightening. We're hitting back levels we've seen that have spurred Fed commentary in the past. Right. Do we really need capitulation?
We may not be done yet. Thanks so much to Kriti Gupta, and you can catch Kriti again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Markets, where she will be the anchor. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We want to keep up to date with news from all around the world, and for that we turn to Ritika Gupta, who is here with the first word. Ritika?
Thanks, David. What did former President Donald Trump know about the attack on the U.S. Capitol, and when did he know it? Those are the questions facing a House committee as it sets out today to prove Trump was directly and even legally culpable in the insurrection. Wyoming Republican Representative Liz Cheney told the panel today Trump was guided that day by an impaired Rudy Giuliani.
You will also hear testimony that President Trump rejected the advice of his campaign experts on election night, and instead followed the course recommended by an apparently inebriated Rudy Giuliani to just claim he won and insist that the vote counting stop, to falsely claim everything was fraudulent.
The committee is not hearing today from Bill Stepien, who led Trump's 2020 re-election campaign. The panel says Stepien has a family emergency. And Russia continued its assault on Ukraine's Luhansk region, pushing Ukrainian troops out of the center in what is Kyiv's last foothold in the area. President Volodymyr Zelensky called fighting over a main city there very fierce. Ukraine's top military commander has pleaded with his U.S. counterpart to send more artillery. French President Emmanuel Macron is facing a challenge in upcoming elections. His party and allies are likely to remain the largest bloc in the National Assembly, according to pollsters looking at the first round of votes. But Macron's majority will likely shrink, just as his margin of victory narrowed in April's presidential election from his result 5 years ago. And record heat is searing the central U.S. today. In St. Louis, temperatures could top 100 degrees. Forecasters say nearly 70 cities across the Midwest and central U.S. could see record temperatures, and that heat is raising the potential for fast-moving thunderstorms to sweep down from the Great Lakes and across the Ohio Valley. Global News 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thank you so much, Ritika. Well, markets are pretty much selling off across the board today, and earlier today that was true even for oil. But now, as we look at the Bloomberg, it looks like both WTI and Brent are actually up just a bit over 0.5%. To give us a sense of the oil markets and what they are telling us about the economy overall, we turn now to Dan Yergin. He's Vice Chairman of S&P Global and author of The New Map: Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. Dan, always great to have you with us. You are our authority on oil. What is the oil market telling us right now about the economy?
Well, the oil market is telling us that demand for oil remains strong and that the supply basically remains weak. Sanctions on Russian oil, Iran not coming back into the market, uncertainty about when China comes out of its COVID thing. But the markets are very tight. And so even though you would expect that with what's happening to the overall, seems to be happening, the overall economy is slowing, it's not showing up yet in demand for oil by any means.
Can we have a recession if oil is over $120 a barrel? Is it possible?
Well, I think the two would interact with each other. I think if we really have a recession, then I think demand does go down, as it always does, demand destruction, and then the price would come down. But I think the circumstances are different this time in that the supply situation is so razor thin, and basically we have a disrupted global oil market.
Let's talk about that razor-thin supply situation. It appears that President Biden may well be visiting the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia when he's over there. Do you expect him to really press the Crown Prince, who appears to be the decision maker, to increase production? And if he does, do you expect the Crown Prince to go along?
Well, first of all, David, if you notice, they say he's not going to talk about oil when he's there, but it's hard to believe that he would be going to Saudi Arabia if it wasn't for oil. Yeah. The thing is, I think the Saudis have been waiting, the Crown Prince has been waiting for Biden to acknowledge him. He was waiting for a phone call. Now he's waiting for a visit. I think if he does come, they'll start to put more oil into the market. They've done a little bit more. The thing is that the news misses is there isn't much more oil in Saudi Arabia and the UAE to really significantly change the market. It would be psychologically very important, but if they actually go down to where their spare capacity is very low, that will also make the markets very nervous, because then you say where's the last security blanket? That's the last security blanket that actually exists for the oil market right now.
Well, that was going to be my question, the psychological question. You know this world so well. Is there some chance that if Saudi Arabia said, yes, we will pump more oil, it would actually drive the price up for just the reason you suggest? That's sort of the fleet in being that doesn't exist anymore.
Well, I think the psychological impact on the market would, in fact, be a calming factor, but people would look basically still at the basic supply-demand balance, and that's what's governing the whole situation right now. I mean, obviously, any more oil is welcome. It's a big disappointment for the market and for the administration and for the Europeans that more Iranian oil will not be coming to the market, because it doesn't appear there's going to be a nuclear deal with Iran. So you just look around and you say the prospects for additional supply are very dim. The biggest growth this year will come out of the United States, actually.
Yeah, I want to come back to the United States, but just before that, OPEC Plus, as I understand, the production cut agreement will go away in August. Isn't that right? What do you expect to happen?
Well, I think that both the Saudis and, of course, the Russians have been very attached to OPEC Plus, but I think this is a way to sort of ease out of it, because OPEC Plus was really a question about how do you bring oil back into the market. That question's not going to be there anymore. Particularly, Russia can't bring more oil back into the market. Its production is actually going down. So I think that OPEC Plus was, maybe the dialogue will continue, and the Saudis still talk about their strategic relationship with Russia, but I think it will no longer have the significance that it's had up till now.
Can Russia's participation in OPEC Plus survive this, if I can call it this, energy crisis precipitated by the war in Ukraine?
Well, it can survive it politically, and it can survive it rhetorically, but I think in reality, no, because Russia has no additional production to bring back. And by the way, several of the other OPEC countries and non-OPEC countries also are not actually able to get back to their previous production levels. Generally, there's been this underinvestment in oil around the world.
I don't want to be too extreme here, but there's something of, if I can call it this, a war over oil between the West and Russia right now, precipitated by Ukraine. Insofar as there is a battle over oil, who's winning it?
Well, I think in the short term, Russia is winning because they're doing so well out of price, making a lot of money from it. But I think that if you look out a year or two, then Russia loses because it's basically destroyed its most important, its baseload market, Europe, because the Europeans are going to really slam the door on Russian energy, and Russia's going to have trouble moving its supplies to other countries. The other thing to keep your eye on, David, is whether these bans on insurance for tankers go into effect. If that happens, it's going to be a lot harder for Russia to move its oil to countries like India and elsewhere in Asia.
Dan, you raised the question of domestic production here in the United States. Is there anything that the Biden administration can do to ramp that up in the short or medium term?
Well, I think I think putting aside the sound bites and stopping to attack the industry because production is going up. I think there are two things. I think it needs to have a much stronger dialogue with the industry to understand supply and demand. And by the way, as Secretary Granholm, the Energy Secretary, said at our conference in March, the message to investors is take your foot off the energy companies and allow them to produce more oil, because it's really the investors who are imposing this discipline and saying, we want money back. Don't step up your production. So they're stepping up their production, but not as much as they might be able to. The other thing that hinders it, of course, is that you still have supply chain problems there, too, in the industry as in other parts of the economy. So it would take longer to do it. But I think those are a couple of things that the administration could do, but as opposed to using the familiar sound bites.
Well, take us into the dynamics there with the investors, insofar as they really have been insisting that the oil companies return the money to them rather than invest it. Given the downturn we're seeing in the financial markets, isn't that all the more difficult as a practical matter? Because a lot of investors are going to say, we'd rather have the dividends, thank you very much, than invest it in the ground.
That, David, is a very good point, because the pressure now, much greater pressure on investors for returns. And this is one of the few places that they can get returns with everything else that's happened in the financial markets.
Okay, Dan, it's always such a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for your time. That's Dan Yergin of S&P Global. Coming up, we get our midterm 2022 update for the week from our political contributors, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Rick Davis. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. It's time now for our weekly midterms 2022 update. We welcome our political contributors, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino of Iona College and Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital. So I want to start in Alaska, which of course takes us to you, Rick, because we now have Sarah Palin on her way back. We identify her with you, rightly or wrongly. So give us a take on what's going on up in Alaska.
Well, they're involved in two elections at the same time, one to fill the vacancy that exists and then to fill out the next term. And it's a very convoluted process, but suffice it to say, out of 48 candidates, the voters of Alaska picked 4 to go into the runoff, and Sarah Palin was number 1 out of those 4, getting about 30% of the vote. And Begich, who is her top competitor within the Republican Party, got about 10% less than she did. So she's off to the races, but the next level of voting, which is rank order, at least for the term that's left open, will determine whether or not she's going to be a congressman.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things up there is that her unfavorables are still at about 59% with one of the latest polls out, but she does have this really core, support that is out there. And of course, she was endorsed by Donald Trump. So she's got the name recognition, she's got some money, and she's got a following there. Then you have so many people in the race. She's doing quite well.
Okay, so let's go to South Carolina, and we've got a Republican congressman who voted to impeach Donald Trump, who appears to be in the running here. Jeannie, what's going on there?
Yeah, there's actually two. So Tom Rice and Nancy Mace, both Nancy Mace spoke out against Donald Trump after January 6th. Tom Rice was one of the 9 to vote to impeach him. And Tom Rice has really stuck to his guns, so to speak, on this. He has not backed down. In fact, I remember when he voted to impeach, many people thought for a moment that it was a mistaken vote, but it was not. And he has, a Trump-endorsed candidate running against him, as does Nancy Mace. And I will just tell you, in the Tom Rice case, the state rep running actually against him has a really interesting ad out with a bunch of villains, from the Joker to everybody else, who are asking the actor playing Tom Rice what he's doing amongst them. And he says, unfortunately, he voted to impeach Trump, and so now he is amongst these villains. And that's how it's going down. There probably goes to a runoff, I think.
It's all a plebiscite on Donald Trump, isn't it, Rick?
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, but you also have the demographics. I mean, Nancy Mace is from a pretty moderate community in Charleston, South Carolina, coastal community. And Rice is from sort of the northeastern part of the state, much more conservative. And so, whereas Nancy Mace looks like a comfortable win, I'd say it's a pick'em race with Tom Rice. So we'll see whether or not that Trump endorsement can pick off one of the last remaining congressmen that voted for impeachment that's left on the ballot.
Okay, let's hit one more of these primaries tomorrow. What about Nevada and the Senate, Rick?
Well, this one's a Donnybrook. The incumbent, Mastro, is vulnerable, and Adam Laxalt just looks like he's poised to win this nomination comfortably. And that will be considered one of the hot races of the country, because if the Republicans can unseat a Democrat incumbent there, they're on their way to a majority. And this is probably one of the top races in the Republican group to be able to do the flip.
And as we're watching the January 6th hearings on today again, the person running, I agree with Rick Laxalt is probably going to be comfortable and win this thing. But he's had a stronger than expected challenge by this Army vet, Sam Brown. And he has been able to raise a lot of money. And he is sort of trying to out MAGA Laxalt, who has a Trump's endorsement. And he is even attacking Laxalt on the fact that while he filed a lawsuit challenging the 2020 results, he lost that result. So if you can imagine, it's not enough that he filed the lawsuit about the election. It's the fact that he lost it that Sam Brown is attacking him on. So that sort of shows you where this argument, and we just heard you interview James Clyburn, that the election was stolen, is really still playing in a lot of these Republican primaries.
Rick, don't I remember the name Laxalt from someplace? Is this the year
Yes,
of the legacy, the year of the legacy all around the country?
One of Ronald Reagan's best friends, the best friend in the United States Senate in 1980, and somebody who really distinguished himself in his Senate career. And so the Laxalt name still resonates very strongly in Nevada, and I think Adam has gotten a great benefit from that. But the politics has changed a lot, and as Jeannie said, now it's about whether or not you can out-Trump Trump. And I think Laxalt, between the name ID and the backing of Donald Trump, will have a comfortable win.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We're seeing legacies all throughout this midterm primary season, from New Jersey to, we just mentioned, Alaska, Nevada. There are so many people who have relatives who are in office or well-known who are running and doing quite well this election season. Last week in New Jersey, we saw that once again. So very much like it used to be in terms of getting into college, being a legacy when you run for office really does help.
It's a family business, I guess. Okay. Many thanks to our political contributors, Jeannie Shanzano of Iona College and Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital, who will be remaining with us, I'm delighted to say, as we turn our attention to those hearings on the January 6th events, as well as the prospects of new gun legislation. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital and Jeannie Shanzano of Iona College have stayed with us as we turn to some of the things going on up at Capitol Hill. So, Jeannie, let's start with you. Gun legislation. A lot of people said it would never happen. It hasn't happened yet, but it looks like it may well.
It may. We heard that they have a framework of a deal, and we just heard Representative Clyburn tell you that he wants to wait to see what the actual language looks like. And I think that makes sense, because let's remember, when you had Pat Toomey and Joe Manchin in 2013, after Sandy Hook, come out with what many people described as a common sense gun restriction legislation. That, in the end, didn't pass, in part because when the language came out, it was attacked and I think unfairly represented to the public. And then you had many people who we thought would support it go against it. So I think we have a long ways to go, but it is a good first step. And I was delighted to hear Representative Clyburn say he would rather have half a loaf than no loaf at all. And we hope that that's what all the Democrats say, because this is a far cry from anything they wanted.
Rick, what are the Republicans saying? I wonder the politics of this. Is this because these mass killings have just gotten so bad they feel they've got some pressure, at least 10 or more Republican senators? Or is it actually a more subtle theory that if we give them this, it's minimal enough, we probably won't have to come back and give them any more anytime soon?
Yeah, I think it's the former, not the latter. I think that Republicans felt under enormous pressure. I think the public has moved on this issue. You can see the public polls are indicating that more and more people want to have, some kind of gun safety legislation. And I think they felt like they had to respond in this case. Much like what Jeannie was saying with the earlier Toomey Manchin bill, they felt like they had to respond. And I think the fact that they had 10 Republicans in the bipartisan working group that frame this legislation kind of ensures its enactment in the United States Senate. Then what happens to it in the House, I can only speculate, but my guess is that, like what Representative Clyburn said today on your show, everybody's going to want the loaf they're handed. And so I think speed is the key. Jeannie said that the Toomey bill got demagogued to death, and I think the key is that the majority leader and the minority leader, McConnell and Schumer, need to get together and move this thing as quick as possible, maybe even by the end of this week or early next week.
Yeah, and one thing I would say, we focus a lot on how difficult a vote this can be for Republicans, but I think we should also know it's difficult for Democrats as well. Many remember that in 2000, Al Gore lost. In part, people blamed it on gun legislation.
I think he lost Tennessee, his home state, if I recall correctly.
That's right, and it's the similar situation for some people, maybe like a Raphael Warnock or the previously mentioned Cortez Masto. So it's a difficult vote for Democrats in purple states, because let's not forget, as much as the polls show Americans support common sense gun legislation, Americans also take their Second Amendment rights very seriously. And anytime those are threatened, they will respond at the ballot box. So a difficult vote, not just for some Republicans, but Democrats as well.
So Rick, let's turn to this January 6th, the House Select Committee that's holding its second day of hearings today. What are you making of this? What effect do you think it's having on the American public?
Well, I think first and foremost, they're laying down sort of the factual record of what happened, not just on January 6th, but the leading up to that. In fact, today's morning hearing has really focused on what happened around Election Day and the subsequent week that followed with these charges that there were fraud. Where did they come from? Who investigated them? What was the campaign saying? And I think that it gives us our first real glimpse into what was happening around that time. And what we found is that people like Attorney General Barr and campaign manager Bill Stepien were telling the president, you lost. There is no fraud. And the fact that he rejected that and went on to listen to other people who were saying, no, you can still win this thing, has been a real turning point for this committee. And of course, that's what they're trying to explain to the American public, is what was the transaction, what occurred along a timeline that forced Trump to come out and start talking about the fact that he still won the election.
Yeah, and I would just follow on that and say, I really think the most important thing that can come out of these hearings is that they show that the election was not stolen, and that people inside Trump's orbit knew that, and they told the president that, whether President Trump believed it or not. This idea that there was election fraud enough to overturn 3 states is something that has got to be debunked out of these hearings, and that's the focus today, and it's critically important.
Any chance of that, Rick? We can put a stake through the heart of Stop the Steal?
I think that they're working on it. I think one of the most effective techniques they're using is they're using people who served in the Trump administration, people in the White House, people at the Justice Department. These are employees of the federal government whose job it is to protect our democracy, but they were working at the pleasure of Donald Trump. It was not in their interest to tell him that he had lost the election, and the same at the campaign. All campaigns want to do is win. It's amazing that Bill Stepien had the frame of mind to say to Donald Trump, you can't go out and claim you won this election. It's not there. And so the fact that they are able to use people who are Republicans is a great cause.
Okay, thank you so much. Really a treat to have our political contributors, Jeannie Shan Zeno of Iona College and Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. And this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.